At Sullivan's Roadside Diner, Rebecca "Becky" Winters wasn't just any waitress pouring coffee and serving pie. Behind her warm smile and worn apron lay the heart and training of a battle-hardened Marine. When the Night Ravens motorcycle gang roared into her diner looking for trouble, they were about to learn the hard way that they'd challenged the wrong woman. The evening had started like any other at Sullivan's. The setting sun painted golden streaks across the checkered floor as Becky moved between tables with military precision, her short blonde hair tucked neatly behind her ears. To the regulars, enjoying their evening meals, she was just the efficient waitress who always remembered their orders and kept their coffee cups full. Few knew about her 3 tours overseas or recognized that her quick, alert movements came from years of combat training rather than serving experience. Frank Sullivan worked the grill, his stocky frame moving with practiced ease as he called out orders. The sizzle of burgers and the clinking of plates created a homey symphony that had become the soundtrack of Becky's post-military life. He'd hired her without hesitation 4 years ago, recognizing something in her steady gaze that told him she was exactly what his diner needed. The diner had become more than just a workplace for Becky. It was her sanctuary, a place where she could rebuild her life after leaving the Corps. The familiar scent of coffee and grilled burgers wrapped around her like a comfort blanket as she moved through her routine. Coach Thompson sat in his usual corner booth, newspaper spread before him, his calloused hands bearing the marks of years training fighters at his downtown gym. Emily Sullivan, Frank's daughter, pored over her medical textbooks at the counter, her dark hair falling forward as she highlighted important passages. The evening crowd was starting to thin out, leaving only the regulars and a few truckers taking their dinner break. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead, casting a warm glow that made the chrome fixtures gleam. Becky wiped down the counter with practiced strokes, her movements efficient but unhurried. She'd learned to appreciate these quiet moments, so different from the chaos of her military days. Yet she never fully relaxed, her training too ingrained to ignore the importance of situational awareness. Officer Rachel Torres pushed through the door, removing her cap and sliding onto a stool at the counter. Her police uniform was crisp despite the long day's shift, and her eyes carried the same alertness that Becky recognized from her own reflection. The local cop had become a regular over the past months, drawn by both the good coffee and the easy camaraderie she found with Becky. They shared an unspoken understanding that came from years of service, albeit in different uniforms. "The usual?" Becky asked, already reaching for a clean mug. The ceramic clinked against the counter as Rachel nodded, then leaned forward, her voice low and concerned. "You might want to keep an eye out tonight, Becky. Word is the Night Ravens are moving through town. They've been causing trouble up and down the coast. 2 diners in the next county over had some nasty encounters with them last week." Becky's hand stilled momentarily as she poured the coffee, the rich aroma rising between them. She'd heard about the Night Ravens. Their reputation for violence and intimidation preceded them. They weren't just another motorcycle club. They were organized, dangerous, and growing bolder with each passing month. But Sullivan's had always been a peaceful spot, a sanctuary of sorts for locals and travelers alike. "Thanks for the heads up," Becky replied, her voice steady. She unconsciously touched the small USMC tattoo on her wrist, a habit she'd developed when her combat instincts kicked in. The familiar texture of the raised ink helped center her thoughts. The distant rumble of motorcycles cut through the evening air like thunder, a sound that seemed to make the coffee cups vibrate ever so slightly on their saucers. The rumbling grew louder, more menacing with each passing second. Conversations died mid-sentence as the regulars tensed, their eyes drawn to the large windows where headlights began to appear, cutting through the growing dusk like predatory eyes. Frank emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron. His weathered face set in a concerned frown as he watched a line of black motorcycles pull into the parking lot, their chrome gleaming menacingly in the fading light. The bikes lined up with military precision, but there was nothing disciplined about the intentions radiating from their riders. Patricia Lancaster, who owned the boutique across the street, clutched her coffee cup tighter, her knuckles turning white. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke. "Maybe we should call the police." Rachel Torres straightened in her seat, her hand instinctively moving toward her hip. But Becky caught her eye and gave a subtle shake of her head. They needed to see what these men wanted before escalating the situation. Sometimes, the presence of law enforcement only made things worse. The diner's bell chimed ominously as the door swung open. Drake, the Raven Morrison, led his gang inside, their heavy boots thudding against the tiled floor in an intimidating rhythm. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees as they entered, their leather jackets adorned with patches that told stories of violence and intimidation. The smell of leather and motorcycle exhaust cut through the homey diner scents. Becky continued wiping down the counter, her movements deliberate and calm. She'd faced worse in the combat zones, and while she hoped this wouldn't end in confrontation, she was prepared if it did. Her eyes met Frank's across the room, and a silent understanding passed between them. Whatever happened next, they would handle it together. The Night Ravens spread out through the diner, claiming territory like an invading force. Their leader, Drake, approached the counter directly, his dark eyes scanning the room before settling on Becky. His lips curled into what might have been meant as a smile, but came across as more of a predatory grin. Behind him, a young woman named Jade Wilson hung back slightly. Unlike the others, her posture betrayed uncertainty, as if she wasn't entirely comfortable with what was about to unfold. Her leather jacket seemed too new, her patches too clean. Becky noted this, filing it away as potentially useful information. The tension in the diner was palpable as everyone waited to see what would happen next. Becky kept her expression neutral, years of training helping her maintain her composure. Whatever these bikers wanted, she knew this quiet evening at Sullivan's was about to become anything but ordinary. Drake Morrison planted his hands on the counter, his leather-clad frame casting a shadow over the polished surface. The silver rings on his fingers clinked against the countertop as he leaned forward, invading Becky's space with deliberate intimidation. "Nice little place you've got here," he drawled, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that made several customers shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Me and my friends could use some refreshments after our long ride." Becky met his gaze steadily, her hands continuing to wipe the counter in measured strokes. "We're happy to serve paying customers who respect our establishment," she replied evenly. Her stance remained relaxed but balanced, ready to move if necessary. The other Night Ravens had positioned themselves strategically throughout the diner. 2 burly men flanked the entrance, while others loomed near occupied booths, making the diners shrink into their seats. Jade Wilson lingered near a window, her fingers drumming nervously against her thigh. "Respect?" Drake chuckled, the sound devoid of humor. "Respect is earned, sweetheart. And from what I hear, this place hasn't earned anything yet." He turned to survey the room, his voice rising. "You see, we're expanding our territory, and every business along this stretch needs to understand how things work now." Frank Sullivan stepped out from behind the grill, his spatula still in hand. "We don't want any trouble here," he said firmly, though his eyes betrayed concern. "Order what you'd like, pay your bill, and move along." Drake's attention shifted to Frank, his smile widening. "Trouble? No, old man, this isn't trouble. This is business. Protection, you might say. Small fee each week, and you won't have to worry about any unfortunate accidents." Officer Torres remained seated at the counter, her hand still near her weapon, but she knew she was outnumbered. Starting a firefight in a crowded diner wasn't an option. Her eyes met Becky's briefly, communicating silent support. "We don't need protection," Becky stated, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from commanding troops in combat zones. "Sullivan's has been here for 20 years without any problems." One of the larger bikers, a man with a scarred face and Crusher tattooed on his neck, laughed harshly. "Times change, lady. Better get used to it." Coach Thompson folded his newspaper deliberately, his weathered face set in disapproval. Emily Sullivan had stopped studying, her medical textbook forgotten as she watched the scene unfold. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Drake's fingers drummed against the counter. "Tell you what," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous purr. "Since we're feeling generous, we'll give you until tomorrow to think it over." Small price to pay for peace of mind, isn't it? As he spoke, two of his men began moving between tables, deliberately bumping into chairs and making customers flinch. One of them accidentally knocked over a trucker's coffee cup, sending hot liquid cascading across the table. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Becky moved swiftly, grabbing a cloth and heading to clean up the spill. As she passed Drake, his hand shot out to grab her arm. "Don't turn your back on me when I'm talking business," he growled. In one fluid motion, Becky twisted out of his grip, her movement so smooth and practiced that it took Drake a moment to realize what had happened. She continued to the spilled coffee, but her eyes never left him as she helped the trucker clean up. "I wouldn't do that again," she said quietly, but her voice carried across the now silent diner. The warning in her tone was clear, and something in her stance made even the toughest of the night ravens pause. Jade Wilson watched the exchange with wide eyes, her hand unconsciously touching her own arm where Drake had grabbed Becky. There was something in the waitress's movements that spoke of more than just diner experience. Drake straightened, adjusting his leather jacket. His face darkened with anger, but he maintained his composure. "Tomorrow," he repeated, his voice hard. "We'll be back tomorrow for an answer. And trust me, you'll want to make the right choice." He signaled to his gang, and they began filing out of the diner. As they passed tables, they made sure to knock over napkin holders and bump chairs, marking their territory like predators. Jade was the last to leave, casting a final glance over her shoulder that seemed almost apologetic. The rumble of motorcycles filled the air again as the night ravens mounted their bikes. Through the windows, Becky watched as they formed up and roared away into the growing darkness, their tail lights glowing like angry red eyes. The diner remained silent for several long moments after they left. Finally, Patricia Lancaster spoke up, her voice shaking. "What are we going to do? If they come back—" "They will come back," Rachel Torres said grimly, standing from her seat. "I'll call it in, but honestly, we don't have enough evidence to do much yet. Not until they actually do something." Becky began picking up the knocked-over items, restoring order to her domain. Her movements were precise and controlled, but her mind was already racing, formulating plans and contingencies. She'd fought against worse odds in worse places, and she wasn't about to let a gang of thugs terrorize her new home. Frank approached her, his face etched with worry. "Becky, maybe we should consider their offer, just until we can figure something else out." She shook her head firmly. "No, Frank. Give in to them once, and they'll own you forever. I've seen it before." She straightened up, surveying the diner that had become her sanctuary. "We're not giving in to bullies. Not now, not ever." After the night raven's departure, Sullivan's diner hummed with a nervous energy. Becky moved methodically through her closing routine, but her trained eyes constantly scanned for potential threats through the large windows. The parking lot remained quiet except for the occasional passing car, their headlights sweeping across the interior like searching fingers. The neon "open" sign flickered slightly, casting alternating shadows across the worn linoleum floor. "You shouldn't have confronted him like that," Frank said, joining her at the counter. He'd flipped the grill's switch to off, but the cooling metal still popped and crackled in the background. His weathered hands gripped the edge of the counter, knuckles white with tension. "Drake Morrison isn't someone to mess with. Last month, a diner in Millbrook stood up to them. 2 days later, it burned to the ground. Nothing left but ashes and broken dreams." Becky continued wiping down the counter, her movements precise and measured. The soft squeak of the cloth against the surface punctuated her words. "And how many other businesses fell in line after that? Fear only gives them more power, Frank. Trust me. I've seen this pattern before, just in different uniforms in different countries. The tactics never change. Only the players do." Rachel Torres had stayed behind after her shift, making calls to neighboring precincts about the night ravens. Her police radio crackled softly with background chatter as she hung up her phone with a frustrated sigh. "They've been building their network for months. Protection rackets, intimidation, maybe worse. But they're smart. They never leave enough evidence for serious charges. They've got people scared, and scared people don't talk. Coach Thompson approached the counter, his newspaper tucked under his arm, the day's headlines bearing witness to other local troubles. Becky's right, give in once, they'll bleed you dry. Besides, he added with a knowing look, his eyes crinkling at the corners, our girl here isn't just any waitress, is she? I've seen that look before. Emily looked up from her textbooks, curiosity bright in her eyes, the medical terminology forgotten as she sensed a deeper story unfolding. What do you mean? 3 tours with the Marines, Coach replied, nodding toward Becky. I recognize the way she moves, the way she handled herself tonight. Saw the same thing in fighters I trained who came back from deployment. That kind of training never leaves you. Patricia Lancaster, who had been quietly nursing her coffee, the liquid long gone cold, spoke up. Her manicured fingers trembled slightly as they gripped the ceramic mug. That's all very impressive, but we're not in a war zone. We're a small town. We can't fight a gang of criminals. They'll destroy everything we've built here. Actually, Becky said, her voice steady as steel, that's exactly what makes them vulnerable. They're used to people giving in, looking away. They don't expect resistance. She paused, considering her next words carefully, years of tactical planning evident in her measured tone. But we need to be smart about this. They'll be watching for police involvement. Rachel nodded grimly, her badge catching the overhead light. She's right. I can increase patrols, but officially my hands are tied until they actually commit a crime. And by then, it might be too late. Then, we'll handle it unofficially, Becky stated, her military training evident in her tone. Frank, do you still have the old security cameras installed? Yeah, but they haven't worked in years. Been meaning to replace them, but money's been tight. I can fix them, Emily. You're good with computers, right? When Frank's daughter nodded, her dark hair falling forward, Becky continued. We'll need eyes everywhere. Coach, your gym has a clear view of the street. Think you could install some cameras there too? Coach Thompson straightened, a spark of purpose in his eyes, his former boxer's stance becoming more pronounced. Already thinking about where to put them. Got some old equipment we could repurpose. That's a start, Rachel said, leaning forward, her coffee forgotten. But what about when they come back tomorrow? They'll be expecting an answer, and they won't take no lightly. Becky's lips curved into a slight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. They'll get one, just not the one they're expecting. She turned to Frank. I need you to trust me on this. What I have in mind. It won't be easy, but it's our best shot. Frank ran a hand through his graying hair, conflict clear on his face. The overhead lights highlighted every worry line earned over decades of hard work. This diner, it's all I have. My whole life savings is tied up in it. Everything I ever wanted to leave to Emily. I know, Becky said softly, her voice carrying the weight of someone who understood sacrifice. That's why we have to fight. Because if we don't, you'll lose it anyway, just slower and more painfully. The bell above the door chimed, making everyone tense. But it was only Jade Wilson, the young biker from earlier, slipping in alone. She looked nervous, constantly glancing over her shoulder, her leather jacket seeming too heavy for her slight frame. You shouldn't be here, Becky said, not unkindly, as she assessed the young woman's body language, noting every telltale sign of fear and uncertainty. I know, Jade stammered, moving closer to the counter, her boots making soft sounds against the floor. But I had to warn you. Drake's not just talking about protection money. He wants to use this place, make it a front for other operations. The diner in Millbrook, they refused that too. That's why. That's why they had to make an example. The information hung heavy in the air, thick as storm clouds. Rachel's hand instinctively moved toward her weapon again, but Becky shook her head slightly. Why are you telling us this? Frank asked, suspicion clear in his voice, his years of experience dealing with people evident in his scrutiny. Jade's fingers twisted together anxiously, the black nail polish chipped and worn. Because I joined looking for family belonging. But this isn't what I signed up for. The things they're planning. She trailed off, looking down at her hands, her voice barely above a whisper. Becky studied the young woman carefully. Her instincts, honed by years of combat experience, told her Jade was telling the truth. "Thank you," she said simply. "But you should go before they notice you're missing." After Jade hurried out, the remaining group looked at each other with renewed concern. The stakes had just gotten much higher. "So what's the plan?" Coach Thompson asked, his voice breaking the tense silence, steady and ready. Becky's expression hardened with determination, her military training coming to the forefront. "First, we prepare. Then, we show Drake Morrison that he picked the wrong diner to mess with." She looked around at the gathered faces, Frank's worry, Emily's determination, Rachel's professional calculation, Coach's quiet strength. "But I'll need all of you to help." One by one, they nodded, unity forming in the face of threat. The night grew deeper outside Sullivan's diner, but inside, a resistance was beginning to take shape. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, but Sullivan's diner buzzed with quiet tension. Becky had arrived 2 hours before her usual shift, working with Emily to install the refurbished security cameras. Their placement was strategic, one overlooking the parking lot, another monitoring the entrance, and 2 more covering blind spots that only someone with combat experience would think to watch. Frank worked the grill as usual, but his movements lacked their typical easy rhythm. Every time the bell above the door chimed, his shoulders would tense, expecting to see Drake Morrison's imposing figure. The morning regulars had picked up on the atmosphere, their conversations more subdued, their eyes darting to the windows more frequently. "Cameras are up and running," Emily announced, climbing down from the stepladder. She brushed dust from her jeans and pulled out her laptop, showing Becky the feed. "I've got them all feeding into this system. We can even access them remotely through our phones." Becky nodded approvingly, noting how the angles covered all critical approaches. "Good work," Coach Thompson called earlier. "His cameras are operational too. Between his gym and the diner, we've got eyes on the whole block." Rachel Torres sat at the counter in civilian clothes, ostensibly enjoying her day off but actually keeping watch. Her personal weapon was concealed beneath her jacket, a fact that brought both comfort and concern. "I've got 3 off-duty officers who'll be dropping by throughout the day. Unofficially, of course." The morning rush came and went without incident, but the lack of Night Raven's presence only added to the tension. It was like watching storm clouds gather on the horizon. You knew the thunder was coming, just not when it would strike. Around noon, Patricia Lancaster hurried in, her face pale. "They're at my shop," she said, sliding onto a stool. "Not the whole gang, just 2 of them. They're browsing." She made air quotes with trembling fingers. "But I know they're sending a message." Becky poured her a cup of coffee, her movements calm and steady. "Did they say anything specific?" "Just that they'd hate to see anything happen to my nice little boutique." Patricia's voice cracked slightly. "I've put 20 years into that store, Becky. Everything I have." "Nothing's going to happen to your store," Becky assured her, though her eyes hardened. The Night Ravens were making their moves, testing the waters, showing the town that nowhere was beyond their reach. Coach Thompson came in for his usual lunch, but today he carried a gym bag that clinked suspiciously when he set it down. He caught Becky's questioning look and gave a slight nod. "Insurance," his expression seemed to say. The afternoon stretched on, each hour ratcheting up the tension. Emily monitored the security feeds while working on her medical texts, multitasking with the efficiency of youth. Frank stress-baked, filling the display case with fresh pies that few customers touched, their appetites diminished by anxiety. Jade slipped in around 3, wearing civilian clothes this time, trying to look inconspicuous. "They're planning something," she whispered to Becky, accepting a cup of coffee with shaking hands. "Drake's got the gang riled up. He's telling them they need to make an example, show the whole town what happens to people who don't fall in line." "When?" Becky asked, her voice low and steady. "Tonight, after closing, Jade swallowed hard. "They're bringing gasoline." The information sent a chill through the diner, though Becky's expression remained unchanged. She'd been expecting this, planning for it. "You should go." "And Jade?" "Thank you." As the young woman slipped out, Becky gathered her core group. Frank, Emily, Rachel, and Coach Thompson huddled near the counter, their faces grim as she relayed Jade's warning. "We should evacuate," Frank said, running his hands through his hair. "Call the police, let them handle it." Rachel shook her head. "By the time we could get official backup here, it would be too late. They'll be watching for police movement." "We stick to the plan," Becky stated firmly. "But now we know their timeline. Emily, call those friends of yours from the computer club. We'll need extra eyes on the security feeds tonight." Coach Thompson opened his gym bag slightly, revealing its contents. Just say the word. The rest of the day passed in a blur of coffee refills and quiet preparation. Regular customers sensed the underlying current of tension and gradually filtered out as evening approached. By closing time, only the core group remained, plus a few trusted allies scattered strategically around the block. As Frank turned the sign to "closed," Becky did one final check of their preparations. The cameras were running, their feeds monitored by Emily and her friends from a secure location. Coach Thompson's insurance was readily accessible, but well hidden. Rachel had positioned her off-duty officers in strategic locations nearby. The sun set, painting the sky in shades of deep purple and crimson. The diner's neon signs cast their usual warm glow, but tonight they felt more like target markers than welcome beacons. Somewhere in the gathering darkness, the night ravens were preparing their own response to Becky's defiance. "Last chance to back out," Becky said to Frank, though she knew what his answer would be. He straightened his apron, years of pride evident in his stance. "This is my place. I'm not running." Becky nodded, feeling the familiar calm of pre-mission focus settling over her. The night was just beginning, and somewhere in the darkness, engines were starting to rumble. The first rumble of motorcycles echoed through the darkened streets around Sullivan's diner at precisely 11:43 p.m. Becky stood at the counter, methodically wiping down surfaces as if it were any other closing time. The security camera's soft whir was barely audible over the hum of the refrigerators and the gentle clink of Frank putting away the last of the clean dishes. "They're coming," Emily's voice crackled through the concealed earpiece Becky wore. 14 bikes moving in from the north, Drake's in the lead, they've got bags with them? Big ones. Her voice remained steady, despite the implications. Coach Thompson sat at his usual booth, newspaper spread before him, though his eyes hadn't moved across the page in minutes. His gym bag rested within easy reach under the table. Rachel Torres had positioned herself at the counter, nursing a cold cup of coffee, her off-duty weapon a reassuring weight against her side. The rumbling grew louder, accompanied by the screech of tires as the night ravens pulled into the parking lot. Through the windows, their headlights cast long, threatening shadows across the diner's interior. The bikes arranged themselves in a semicircle, creating a wall of chrome and leather facing the entrance. "Everyone ready?" Becky asked quietly, receiving subtle nods in response. Frank moved to stand behind the counter, his hands gripping the edge so tightly his knuckles showed white. He'd refused to leave despite Becky's suggestions. "This is my life's work," he'd said. "I'm seeing this through." The bell above the door chimed as Drake Morrison strode in, flanked by his lieutenants. The rest of the gang filtered in behind them, their boots heavy on the linoleum floor. Jade lingered near the back, her face a mask of anxiety. 2 gang members carried large duffel bags that clinked ominously as they walked. Well, Drake drawled, spreading his arms wide. "Looks like you're still open for business. I'm surprised. I thought our little chat yesterday might have knocked some sense into you." Becky continued wiping the counter, her movements unhurried. "We're always open for paying customers, but we're about to close, so if you're not ordering..." Drake's smile didn't reach his eyes. Oh, we're not here to order. We're here to deliver a message, one that the whole town will remember. He nodded to his men with the bags, who began moving toward different corners of the diner. I wouldn't do that if I were you, Becky said calmly, finally setting down her cloth and meeting Drake's gaze directly. No? Drake's voice carried a dangerous edge. And why's that? Because you used to be a Marine? Because you think you can take us all? He laughed, the sound echoing off the windows. Look around, sweetheart. You're outnumbered, and after tonight, you won't even have a place to serve coffee anymore. Becky's stance shifted subtly, her weight redistributing in a way that only someone with combat training would recognize. Last chance, Drake, walk away, find somewhere else to be tonight. Or what? Drake's amusement turned to anger. You'll call the cops? They won't get here in time. You'll fight us? Please. I've got 14 people in here, and that's just the beginning. This isn't a battle you can win. You're right about one thing, Becky replied, her voice taking on a harder edge. This isn't a battle, because we've already won it. She raised her voice slightly. Now. Suddenly, red targeting dots appeared on the chests of several night ravens, including Drake. Through the windows, the gang members could see multiple figures emerging from the shadows around the parking lot, their weapons trained on the diner. Emily's computer club friends had hacked the streetlights, plunging the area into strategic darkness except for key spots of illumination. See, while you were planning your message, Becky continued, her voice steady, we were sending one of our own. Those cameras you probably noticed, they're not just recording. They're broadcasting live to every law enforcement agency in 3 counties, plus a few newspaper offices. Your faces, your bikes, your license plates, everything. Drake's confidence wavered for the first time. You're bluffing. Look outside, Rachel spoke up, standing from her spot at the counter. Those aren't just off-duty cops out there. That's half the town. People who are tired of being afraid. People who are ready to stand up to bullies like you. Indeed, beyond the ring of tactical lights, more shadows were moving. Shopkeepers, residents, even some of the truckers who regularly stopped at Sullivan's, all positioning themselves strategically around the diner. And those bags your men are carrying? Becky added. The ones with the gasoline? That's not just attempted arson anymore. That's felony conspiracy, caught on multiple cameras with dozens of witnesses. How many years do you think that's worth, Drake? The gang leader's face contorted with rage as he realized the trap he'd walked into. Some of his men were already backing toward the door, their earlier bravado evaporating in the face of real resistance. Jade suddenly stepped forward, shrugging off her leather jacket with the Night Raven's insignia. I'm done, she announced, moving to stand near Becky. The action seemed to break a spell, and 2 more gang members followed suit, clearly relieved to have an exit option. Drake's hand twitched toward his jacket, but Coach Thompson's voice cut through the tension. Son, if you're thinking about reaching for what I think you are, you should know I've got you in my sights. 20 years military sniper, and I haven't lost my touch. For a long moment, the diner balanced on a knife's edge of possibility. Then Drake's shoulders slumped, defeat writing itself across his features. The night hadn't gone as planned, and everyone knew it. Out, Becky commanded, her voice carrying the full weight of military authority. Leave your bags, and don't come back. Drake's face twisted with barely contained rage as his carefully constructed plan crumbled around him. The night ravens began backing toward the door, their earlier bravado replaced by uncertain glances and nervous movements. The red targeting dots followed their retreat, a constant reminder of their vulnerable position. This isn't over, Drake snarled, but his threat lacked its earlier menace. You think a few cameras and some weekend warriors can stop us? We own this territory. Not anymore, Rachel stated firmly, producing her badge. And for the record, those cameras caught everything, including your admission about Millbrook's diner. That arson case just got interesting again. Outside, more vehicles were arriving, not with sirens blazing, but with deliberate purpose. Personal cars belonging to off-duty officers, trucks driven by local business owners, even a bus full of Coach Thompson's boxing students. The community had turned out in force, forming a wall of solidarity more intimidating than any gang display. As the night ravens filtered out, Jade remained behind with the three others who had abandoned their jackets. They huddled near the counter, looking both relieved and terrified at their decision. Becky nodded to Emily, who guided them to a back booth, away from windows and prying eyes. "You'll need protection," Coach Thompson said, approaching the former gang members. "My gym's got spare rooms upstairs. Secure entrance, good sight lines. You'll be safe there until we sort this out." Drake paused at the door, his hand gripping the frame so hard his knuckles went white. "You've just made enemies of the wrong people. We've got connections you can't imagine." "So do we," Becky replied calmly. "The difference is, ours are legitimate. Now go, before I decide to let Rachel process those arrests she's been wanting to make." The night air filled with the sound of motorcycles roaring to life, but this time the noise carried frustration rather than intimidation. The night ravens pulled out of the parking lot in disarray, their formation broken, their unity shattered. Several bikes peeled off in different directions instead of following Drake, suggesting the gang's cohesion was already fracturing. Inside the diner, the tension slowly began to ease. Frank slumped against the counter, exhaustion evident in every line of his face. "I can't believe that worked," he muttered, running a trembling hand through his hair. "Oh, it's not over," Rachel cautioned, already on her phone coordinating with other officers. "They'll regroup, try something else, but we've got them on the back foot now, and more importantly, we've got evidence." Emily's laptop chimed with incoming messages. "The feeds are going viral," she announced, her eyes scanning the screen. "Local news stations are picking it up. Someone's already created a hashtag, #stand with Sullivans." Patricia Lancaster burst through the door, her normally perfect hair disheveled from the night air. "Is everyone all right? We saw them leave. The whole town's talking about it." "We're fine," Becky assured her, already moving to make fresh coffee. They would need it. This night was far from over. But now comes the hard part. We've shown them we can stand up to them. Next, we have to prove we can keep standing. Coach Thompson began coordinating with his students, setting up watch rotations for the defectors. The young fighters were eager to help, their boxing training giving them both the discipline and the capability to serve as effective guards. "The cameras stay up," Becky continued, addressing the group that had gathered in the diner. "The watches continue, and tomorrow we start reaching out to other businesses. The night ravens aren't just our problem, they're targeting the whole region. It's time everyone learned how to fight back." Rachel nodded in agreement. "I'll coordinate with neighboring departments. Now that we have solid evidence of their activities, we can build a real case. But it'll take time." "Time we've bought," Frank said, his confidence returning. He straightened his apron and moved toward the kitchen. "And right now, I think everyone could use some pie. On the house." The suggestion broke the remaining tension. People began settling into booths and chairs, the adrenaline of the confrontation giving way to the warm satisfaction of victory, however temporary it might be. Jade and the other defectors gradually relaxed, accepting cups of coffee and slices of Frank's apple pie. Becky moved through the diner, checking on everyone, her military training evident in the way she continued to monitor sightlines and positions even in this moment of relative peace. She knew Drake's threat wasn't empty. The Night Ravens would respond. But they had changed the game tonight, transformed it from a simple intimidation tactic into something more complex. "You know," Coach Thompson said quietly as she passed his booth, "this reminds me of some operations I ran overseas. Sometimes the biggest victories don't come from overwhelming force. They come from showing the enemy that their usual tactics won't work anymore." Becky nodded, understanding the deeper meaning in his words. They hadn't just protected the diner tonight. They had challenged the fundamental strategy that groups like the Night Ravens relied on. Fear worked only as long as people remained isolated. Unity, preparation, and courage could transform a vulnerable target into an impenetrable fortress. Outside, the night settled into watchful quiet. The protectors took up their positions, cameras continued their silent vigilance, and Sullivan's diner stood as a beacon of defiance against the darkness. The following days brought a tense calm to Sullivan's diner. Word of the confrontation spread quickly through the town and beyond, drawing both support and scrutiny. Local news vans became a regular sight in the parking lot, their reporters eager to cover the story of a small-town diner standing up to organized intimidation. Becky maintained her usual routine, serving coffee and meals with the same efficient precision, but her vigilance never wavered. Every customer was assessed, every movement outside noted and evaluated. The security cameras continued their constant surveillance, now supplemented by additional volunteers who kept watch from strategic positions around the neighborhood. "They're regrouping," Rachel reported during her morning coffee stop, her voice low despite the breakfast crowd's chatter. "Sources say Drake's holed up in a compound outside town. He's been making calls, calling in favors. This isn't over." "We knew it wouldn't be," Becky replied, refilling the officer's cup. "What about the defectors? Any trouble?" "Coach Thompson's gym is secure. His students are taking the protection detail seriously, maybe too seriously. Had to tell them to tone down the intimidating looks they were giving random passers-by." Frank emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron. "Business is up," he said, glancing at the nearly full diner. "People are coming in just to show support. Even got calls from other towns asking how we did it." The bell above the door chimed, and Jade entered with two of the other defectors. They had traded their leather gang jackets for civilian clothes, though their cautious movements betrayed their lingering anxiety. They took seats at the counter, positioned to watch both the entrance and the windows. "Drake's bringing in reinforcements," Jade said quietly as Becky placed menus before them. "Calling in members from other chapters. He's telling them this is about respect, about maintaining territory. But, really?" She shook her head. "He's scared." "What happened here?" "It's never happened before." Emily looked up from her laptop where she monitored the security feeds. "We've got movement on 3rd Street. 4 bikes, Ravens colors." Her fingers flew across the keyboard. "Sending the feed to Rachel's department now." The bikers cruised past the diner slowly, their engines deliberately loud. Through the windows, their hostile glares met only calm observation from those inside. They circled the block twice before moving on, their attempted intimidation falling flat against the diner's new defenses. "Testing our response," Coach Thompson commented from his usual booth. "Seeing if we're maintaining our guard." His gym bag still rested beside him, its contents a reassuring presence. Patricia Lancaster hurried in, clutching her tablet. "You need to see this," she said, approaching Becky. She pulled up a social media page where dozens of posts detailed similar stories of intimidation from neighboring towns. "People are starting to speak out. Your stand here? It's giving others courage." Becky studied the posts, noting locations and patterns. "We need to coordinate," she decided. "Get these other businesses talking to each other. Share information, resources, strategies." "Already on it," Emily chimed in. "I've set up a secure communication network. Private channel, verified members only. We can share real-time updates about Raven's movements and activities." The diner had become more than just a restaurant. It was transforming into a command center for community resistance. Maps appeared on tables marking known night ravens locations and suspected safe houses. Business owners from neighboring towns began dropping by, seeking advice and offering support. Frank watched it all with a mixture of pride and concern. "Never thought my diner would become resistance headquarters," he mused, sliding a fresh piece of pie toward Becky. "Best place for it," she replied. "Hidden in plain sight, plus your coffee keeps the volunteers alert." The afternoon brought more drive-bys, each one documented and analyzed. The Ravens were clearly building toward something, but their usual tactics had lost their impact. Every intimidation attempt was met with cameras, witnesses, and immediate police response. "They'll have to change strategy soon," Rachel observed during her evening check-in. "Standard intimidation isn't working anymore. That makes them dangerous. Cornered animals always are." Becky nodded, her military experience lending weight to the assessment. "We need to be ready for escalation." They'll try something big, try to regain their reputation. As if on cue, Emily's laptop chirped an alert. Multiple ravens spotted heading toward Coach's gym, she reported, her voice tense. Looks like they're targeting the defectors. Coach Thompson was already moving, his students appearing as if summoned. The gym's security protocols, designed by Becky, kicked into action. Within minutes, the potential targets were secure, and armed response teams were in position. The ravens pulled up short when they saw the gym's defenses, not just cameras and lights, but dozens of trained fighters visible through the windows, their stance making it clear this wouldn't be an easy target. "Send them the message," Becky instructed Emily, who nodded and pressed a key. Every screen in the area, phones, tablets, laptops, suddenly displayed the security footage of the ravens' approach, broadcast live. Their attempt at intimidation had become public theater, exposing their tactics to the world. The bikers retreated, but their frustrated rage was palpable. This wasn't just about one diner anymore. It was becoming a full-scale community uprising against their control. As night fell, Becky surveyed the diner's defenses one last time. The cameras watched silently, volunteers maintained their posts, and the community's resolve remained strong. But she knew the real test was still to come. Drake Morrison wouldn't accept defeat easily, and his next move would be decisive. The first sign that something had shifted came 3 days after the failed gym attack. Sullivan's morning rush was in full swing when Emily's laptop erupted with alerts from multiple security feeds. Becky moved to check the screens, coffee pot still in hand, her movements deliberately casual to avoid alarming the customers. "Multiple groups," Emily reported quietly, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "They're setting up checkpoints on all the major roads into town. These aren't just local ravens. There are colors from at least 3 different chapters." Rachel Torres burst through the door, her uniform slightly disheveled as if she'd dressed in a hurry. "They're blocking deliveries," she announced, sliding onto a counter stool. "Food trucks, supply vehicles, everything. They're trying to squeeze the whole town." Frank emerged from the kitchen, his face tight with concern. "I've got maybe 3 days of supplies," he said, keeping his voice low. "After that?" He let the implication hang in the air. "It's not just us," Patricia added, hurrying in from her boutique. "Every business on the strip is getting the same calls. The ravens are offering to escort deliveries through, for a price. Double what we'd normally pay, plus their protection fee." Becky's mind raced through scenarios, her military training kicking in. This was siege tactics, more sophisticated than the ravens' usual approach. Drake was adapting, learning from his failures. "They're trying to turn the town against us," Coach Thompson observed from his usual spot. "Make everyone suffer until they pressure us to give in." The diner's regular customers were starting to notice something was wrong. Conversations became hushed, worried glances were exchanged. The unity they'd built was being tested in a way that violence and intimidation hadn't managed. "We need to change the game again," Becky said finally, setting down the coffee pot. "Emily, get me everything you can on those checkpoints, numbers, positions, patterns. Rachel, what kind of official response can we expect?" "State police are monitoring, but without direct violence, their hands are tied. The ravens are being careful. Technically, they're just parked on public roads." Jade, who had been quietly nursing a cup of coffee, spoke up. "Drake's got a weak point he doesn't know about yet. The other chapters? They're not here out of loyalty. He promised them a cut of a growing territory, easy money. If this starts costing them instead." Becky nodded slowly, a plan forming. "Emily, how's that communication network with other towns coming along?" "Growing by the hour. We've got businesses from 3 counties connected now. Everyone's watching what happens here." "Good, because we're going to show them exactly what solidarity looks like." Becky gathered her core group: Frank, Rachel, Coach Thompson, Emily, and Patricia, at a corner booth. "Here's what we're going to do." The plan came together over the next few hours. Emily's computer club friends began hacking traffic cameras, documenting every vehicle that passed through the Ravens' checkpoints. Rachel quietly coordinated with sympathetic officers in neighboring jurisdictions. Coach Thompson's students, many of whom worked delivery jobs, began mapping alternate routes into town. By afternoon, Sullivan's had become the hub of an underground supply network. Back roads and forgotten farm tracks, unused since the highway was built, suddenly saw traffic again. Local farmers, angry at the Ravens' interference, offered their land as waypoints. Small convoys of private vehicles, coordinated through Emily's secure network, began moving supplies in patterns too random for the Ravens to track. "They can't block every road," Becky explained to the gathered business owners, "and they can't stop what they can't see coming." The Ravens' frustration became evident as their checkpoint strategy began to fail. Supplies were still reaching town, but they couldn't figure out how. Their attempts to follow suspicious vehicles led nowhere, thanks to Coach Thompson's students running interference with their own motorcycles. "Drake's getting pressure from the other chapters," Jade reported during a quiet moment. "They came here expecting easy money, not a drawn-out siege. Every day this continues, they're losing face." Frank, checking his inventory that evening, managed a small smile. "We've got more supplies now than when they started the blockade. Word's spreading. People are driving from 2 counties over just to bring us groceries, just to be part of this." The diner's tables were covered with maps and laptops, local business owners coordinating delivery schedules and routes. Patricia Lancaster, who had once advocated giving in to the Ravens, was now running logistics for half the town's supply lines. "This is more than just survival," she said, updating her spreadsheets. "We're showing them that their old ways of doing things don't work anymore. The more they squeeze, the more we adapt." Becky watched the operation with quiet pride. The community hadn't just resisted, it had evolved, turning a crisis into an opportunity to build something stronger. Every failed Ravens tactic exposed more of their weaknesses, brought more people into the resistance network. As night fell, Emily's laptop pinged with new messages from other towns. They weren't just asking for advice anymore. They were implementing their own networks, creating a web of mutual support that the Ravens couldn't intimidate or control. "They wanted to isolate us," Coach Thompson observed, watching the coordination unfold. "Instead, they've united the entire region against them." Becky nodded, but kept her satisfaction in check. She knew Drake wouldn't accept this defeat easily. The siege had failed, but that only meant his next move would be more desperate and more dangerous. The question wasn't if he would strike back, but when and how hard. The network they'd built would face its ultimate test soon, and everything depended on being ready when it came. The attack came at dawn, but not where they expected it. The first warning was a frantic call from 2 towns over. The Ravens had hit 3 businesses simultaneously, smashing windows and leaving burning motorcycles in their wake. Before police could respond, they'd vanished, only to strike again 20 miles away. "They're sending a message," Rachel said grimly, spreading a map across Sullivan's counter. Red pins marked each attack site, forming a pattern that was closing in on their town. "Drake's showing what happens to anyone who helps us." Becky studied the pattern, her military training recognizing the strategy. "They're trying to isolate us again, but differently this time. Not with roadblocks, but with fear. Make people too scared to support us." Emily's laptop chimed constantly with updates from their network. Business owners were panicking, some already talking about cutting ties with Sullivan's resistance. The unity they'd built was being tested by the harsh reality of burning storefronts and shattered glass. "We can't protect everyone," Coach Thompson said, his voice heavy with frustration. "We're spread too thin, and they're hitting random targets." Frank worked the grill with nervous energy, though few customers had braved coming in after news of the attack spread. "Maybe we should shut down for a few days," he suggested. "Let things cool off." "That's exactly what they want," Becky replied, her voice firm. "If we close now, we'll never reopen. Not really." She turned to Emily. "How many businesses are still connected to our network?" "Numbers are dropping, but we've still got about 60%. The bigger towns are holding steady. It's the smaller places that are scared." Jade burst through the door, out of breath. They hit Mike's auto shop in Riverdale, set fire to 3 cars. Mike's talking about paying them off, saying he can't afford to lose his whole business. Patricia Lancaster, who'd been quietly working on supply logistics, stood up. Let me talk to him. And the others who are wavering. They need to hear from someone who understands what they're going through. Rachel's radio crackled with reports of more attacks, each one calculated to spread maximum fear, with minimum risk of serious police response. The Ravens would strike, cause damage, and disappear before authorities could mobilize. We need to change the story, Becky said suddenly. Right now, everyone's seeing isolated attacks. We need to show them the bigger picture. She turned to Emily. Can you get into the traffic cameras around each attack site? Emily nodded, already typing. Most of them? Yeah. What are we looking for? Patterns, routes. They have to be coordinating these hits somehow. Nobody moves that fast without a plan. The next few hours turned Sullivan's into an intelligence center. Emily's computer club friends helped piece together traffic camera footage, while Rachel coordinated with other departments to gather witness statements. Coach Thompson's students, now acting as couriers, brought in photographs and videos from attack sites. Look at this, Emily said finally, pointing to her screen. Before each attack, there's a black SUV that drives through. Different plate each time, but same model, same tinted windows. Command and control, Becky murmured. They're using it to coordinate the attacks. The bikers are just following instructions. Can we track it? Rachel asked, leaning in to study the footage. Better, Emily replied with a grim smile. We can predict where it's going next. The pattern's not random. They're working their way through a list. And I think I know what's on it. She pulled up a map showing businesses that had actively supported Sullivan's resistance network. The attack sites aligned perfectly with their locations. They got the list somehow, Jade said quietly. Drake must have sources we don't know about. Becky's expression hardened. Then we use that against them. Emily, send out a warning to everyone on our network, but add some fake locations. Places we know are sympathetic to the Ravens. A trap? Coach Thompson asked, catching on. More like a test, Becky explained. If those locations get hit, we'll know exactly where the leak is coming from. The plan was set in motion quickly. Emily seeded their network with carefully crafted misinformation, while Rachel quietly positioned plainclothes officers near the suspected targets. Coach Thompson's students, looking like ordinary teenagers on bikes, kept watch from a safe distance. The wait was tense. The morning stretched into afternoon with no new attacks. Then, just as the sun began to set, Emily's laptop lit up with alerts. They took the bait, she announced. The SUV just passed through Miller's Crossing, one of our fake locations. Rachel was already on her radio, coordinating with other units. All the cameras in that area are live streaming to every police department in 3 counties. Whatever they're planning, we'll have it all on video. Becky watched the feeds intently, noting how the Ravens formed up for their attack run. But something felt off about their approach. Wait, she said suddenly. This is too easy. They're not this sloppy. She studied the pattern again. Then her eyes widened. It's a diversion. Emily, check the cameras around Sullivan's. Now. Emily switched feeds just in time to see multiple dark figures moving through the shadows toward the diner. While they'd been focused on the fake target, Drake had brought his real attack force right to their door. Everyone out, Becky ordered, her voice carrying the sharp edge of command. Back exits only. Emily, trigger the protocols. Rachel, get your people in position. The trap had become a counter-trap. But Becky had been preparing for this moment since the first day. As the diner's lights went dark, she moved to her position, knowing the real battle for Sullivan's was about to begin. In the darkened diner, shadows moved with deliberate precision. Becky positioned herself behind the counter, her back to the kitchen where Frank and Emily had retreated to the secure room they'd prepared weeks ago. Through her earpiece, she could hear the quiet chatter of Coach Thompson's students reporting movements from their observation posts around the building. 6 men approaching from the east lot, came one whispered report. Drake's with them. They're carrying, looks like crowbars and chains. 3 more coming up the back alley, another voice added. Got gas cans with them. Definitely not here for coffee. Rachel's voice cut through the radio chatter. Police units are 4 minutes out, maintaining radio silence as requested. We've got the perimeter sealed 2 blocks out. The security cameras, now running on backup power, showed the Ravens spreading out around the diner. Their movements were more disciplined than usual. Drake had clearly brought his best for this operation. Through the windows, Becky could see Jade's replacement in the gang, a hard-faced woman they called Viper, directing teams into position. They're not just here to scare us this time, Coach Thompson observed from his position near the kitchen. His gym bag lay open beside him, its contents distributed strategically around the diner. This is meant to be a finishing move. Good, Becky replied quietly. Because so is this. The first crash came from the back door, a coordinated attempt to breach multiple entrances simultaneously. But the reinforced doors, installed after the first confrontation, held firm. Becky could hear frustrated curses from outside. Cameras show them regrouping, Emily reported through the earpiece. They're backing off. Something's wrong. Drake's voice carried through the night air, loud enough to be heard inside. We know you're in there, Winters. Did you really think we wouldn't figure out your little network? All those businesses trying to play hero. They're learning their lesson right now. Becky's hand tightened on the counter, but she remained silent. This was part of the plan. Let them think they had the upper hand. No response? Drake called out. Fine, maybe this will get your attention. Multiple engines roared to life in the parking lot. Through the windows, Becky could see Ravens positioning their bikes, headlights aimed at the diner like spotlight beams. They're going to try to blind us, Coach Thompson muttered. Classic intimidation tactic. Emily? Becky spoke into her radio. Are we recording all of this? Every angle, full audio, broadcasting live to every connection in our network. The Ravens began their approach again, more cautiously this time. The first window shattered under a thrown crowbar, sending glass skittering across the floor. But instead of creating an entry point, it triggered something else entirely. Powerful LED floods, hidden in the diner's renovated exterior, blazed to life. The sudden illumination caught the Ravens off guard, destroying their night vision and exposing their positions to the cameras. Simultaneously, sprinklers activated. But what sprayed from them wasn't water. Industrial-grade paint markers. Becky explained to no one in particular, allowing herself a small smile. Impossible to wash off, unique chemical signature. Rachel's idea. The Ravens scrambled backward, but the damage was done. Their clothes, bikes, and skin were now marked with evidence that would be impossible to deny. Through the chaos, Becky could hear Drake shouting orders, trying to regain control of the situation. Phase 2, she commanded into her radio. Around the block, engines roared to life, not motorcycles, but dozens of cars and trucks. The community members who'd been waiting in shadow pulled into predetermined positions, boxing in the Ravens' escape routes. At the same time, powerful spotlights mounted on nearby buildings illuminated the entire area. You wanted to trap us, Becky called out, her voice carrying across the parking lot. But we've been ready for this since day one. Drake's response was a roar of rage. Burn it, he commanded. Burn it all. But as his men reached for their gas cans, another surprise awaited them. Coach Thompson's students emerged from hiding, not with weapons, but with phones and cameras. Every action the Ravens took was being documented from multiple angles, streamed live to thousands of viewers. That's enough evidence for multiple felony charges, Rachel's voice announced over a police loudspeaker. The entire area is surrounded. Lay down your weapons and surrender. The Ravens' formation began to break. Some dropped their weapons immediately while others looked to Drake for guidance. The gang leader stood in the center of the chaos, his carefully planned attack crumbling around him. "It's over, Drake," Becky called out, finally stepping into view. "Your old tactics don't work anymore. They never will again." Viper was the first to break ranks, throwing down her crowbar and raising her hands. Others followed suit, the paint on their clothes marking them unmistakably as participants in the attack. Drake looked around at his disintegrating force, his face contorted with fury. With a sudden movement, he reached into his jacket, but Coach Thompson was faster. A beanbag round from his position caught Drake in the shoulder, sending him sprawling. "Like the lady said," Coach Thompson announced, emerging from his position. "It's over." Police units began moving in, their lights painting the scene in red and blue. The community members maintained their blockade, ensuring no one could slip away in the confusion. Through her earpiece, Becky could hear Emily confirming that every moment had been captured and preserved. The Night Ravens' reign of terror had ended not with a dramatic battle, but with the failure of their own tactics against a prepared and united community. As Rachel began reading rights to the arrested gang members, Becky allowed herself to finally relax. Sullivan's Diner had become more than just a business. It had become a symbol of resistance, a blueprint for other communities facing similar threats. The night wasn't over yet, but the hardest part was done. The real work, rebuilding and strengthening their community, could now begin. The aftermath of the Night Ravens' failed attack unfolded like a well-orchestrated symphony. Police vehicles lined the street, their lights casting alternating patterns of red and blue across Sullivan's facade. Rachel Torres coordinated with state police as they processed the arrested gang members, each one still marked with the telltale paint that would connect them irrefutably to the attack. Frank had emerged from the secure room and immediately started brewing coffee, not for customers this time, but for the police officers and community members who had helped defend the diner. The familiar aroma helped restore a sense of normalcy to the chaos-struck scene. "We're trending," Emily announced from her laptop station, where she continued monitoring their network. The live stream reached over 50,000 viewers. News stations are already calling for footage. She looked up at Becky. "People are calling it the Sullivan strategy, using technology and community organization to stand up to organized intimidation." Coach Thompson's students helped clear the broken glass while maintaining their watch positions. The night wasn't over, and years of training had taught Becky to stay vigilant until the situation was fully secured. "Found these in their bikes," Rachel said, approaching with an evidence bag. Inside were documents, lists of businesses, delivery routes, schedules. They had inside information all right. Looks like they had someone in the city planning office. Jade, who had arrived with the police, studied the arrested gang members as they sat handcuffed on the curb. "Most of them are from other chapters," she noted. Drake promised them easy money, told them this town was soft. Instead, they're facing federal charges. Detective Sarah Martinez from the state police approached, her badge glinting under the emergency lights. "Ms. Winters, we're going to need a formal statement, but I want you to know, this is bigger than just tonight. We've got enough evidence here to connect the Ravens to dozens of incidents across 3 states. Becky nodded, watching as officers cataloged the gang members' bikes and weapons. "What about the other businesses they hit? The ones they attacked before coming here?" "Already got units there," Rachel interjected. "Turns out most of those attacks were more smoke than fire, literally. They were trying to spread fear, make it look worse than it was, still criminal but no major damage." Patricia Lancaster arrived with a group of other business owners, bringing food and supplies for the officers and volunteers. The community's response had transformed from fear to organized support in a matter of hours. "The supply network's holding strong," Patricia reported. "If anything, tonight's made it stronger. We're getting calls from businesses in other counties wanting to join." Drake Morrison sat alone in the back of a police vehicle, his face a mask of impotent rage as he watched his empire crumble. The paint that marked him glowed faintly under the emergency lights, a fluorescent badge of failure. "You know what the real irony is?" Coach Thompson mused, standing beside Becky as they watched the scene unfold. They tried to use fear to control this town, but their tactics just taught us how to be fearless. Inside the diner, Emily continued coordinating with their network, sharing updates, and connecting communities. The system they'd built to defend against the Ravens had evolved into something more, a framework for mutual support and protection that transcended their immediate crisis. "We've got commitments from 17 businesses to testify," Rachel announced, checking her phone. "Plus surveillance footage from at least 30 locations. The DA's already talking about RRICO charges." Viper, still marked with paint, was cooperating with the police, providing names and locations of Ravens operations across the region. The gang's hierarchy was unraveling rapidly as members rushed to make deals. Frank approached Becky with a fresh cup of coffee, his hand still slightly shaking from the night's events. "Never thought my little diner would become famous for something like this," he said with a weak smile. "It's not about the diner," Becky replied, accepting the coffee. "It's about what it represents. People standing together, refusing to be victims." The sky was beginning to lighten, the first hints of dawn painting the horizon. Emergency vehicles began to disperse, their work done for now. But Sullivan's parking lot remained full of community members, no longer willing to hide in the shadows. "We'll need to adapt again," Becky continued, addressing the gathered group. "The Ravens aren't the only ones who prey on small communities. Others will try their tactics." "Let them try," Coach Thompson said firmly. "We've got something better than muscle now. We've got a blueprint for fighting back." Emily closed her laptop, stretching after hours of coordination. "The network's stable," she reported, "and growing. We've got people offering to help set up similar systems in other towns." As the initial chaos settled into organized cleanup, Becky walked through the diner, assessing the damage. The broken window would need replacing, but the reinforced doors had held. More importantly, the spirit of the place remained unbroken. "So, what now?" Rachel asked, joining her at the counter. Becky smiled, a plan already forming. "Now we teach others what we've learned. Build something bigger than just defending one diner." The first rays of sunlight streamed through the windows, marking the beginning of a new chapter. Sullivan's Diner had become more than just a battleground. It had become a symbol of hope, a testament to what communities could achieve when they stood together against intimidation. 1 month after the Night Ravens' failed attack, Sullivan's Diner hummed with a different kind of energy. The broken window had been replaced, the security system subtly upgraded, and business was better than ever. But the biggest changes weren't physical. They were in the way people carried themselves, the confidence that had replaced fear. Becky moved between tables with her usual efficiency, but now customers greeted her as more than just a waitress. They knew her story, understood what she represented. The local paper had run a feature article titled "The Veteran Who Saved More Than Just a Diner," though Becky had insisted the real story was about community, not individual heroics. "Another delivery coming in," Emily announced from her usual spot, her laptop now a permanent fixture at the counter. The network they'd built had evolved into a formal business alliance, with Sullivan serving as its unofficial headquarters. 3 new shops joined this morning: hardware store in Millbrook and 2 restaurants in River Junction. Frank emerged from the kitchen, carrying a fresh apple pie. His pride in the diner had taken on new dimensions. It wasn't just his life's work anymore, but a symbol of resistance and unity. "State police called," Rachel reported, sliding onto her regular stool. "Drake's trial starts next week. Between the video evidence and witness testimonies, prosecution's confident. The DA's using our case as a template for going after similar organizations." Coach Thompson's gym had expanded, adding self-defense classes specifically designed for business owners and their staff. "It's not about fighting," he'd explained to new students. "It's about confidence, about knowing you don't have to be a victim." Jade had found her place too, working with other former gang members to help them transition to legitimate lives. The support network that had defended against the Ravens now served a broader purpose, connecting people with resources and opportunities. "You should see the case studies," Patricia Lancaster said, spreading papers across her usual table. 3 universities are analyzing what we did here. They're calling it community-based defense strategy, using technology and social networks to counter organized intimidation. The bell above the door chimed as Viper entered, not as a threat now, but as another success story. After testifying against the Ravens, she'd started working with law enforcement, helping other communities identify and prevent gang activity. "Got word from up north," she reported, accepting a coffee from Becky. 2 more chapters disbanded last week. Without Drake's network, they couldn't maintain control. Communities are using your playbook, setting up their own defense networks. Emily's computer chimed with new alerts. "Check this out," she called, turning her screen. News footage showed another town successfully repelling an attempted gang takeover, using strategies they'd learned from Sullivan's. "They're adapting faster than we did," Becky observed, watching the footage. "Learning from our mistakes, improving the system." Frank nodded thoughtfully. "That's the real victory, isn't it? Not just protecting one diner, but showing others they can protect themselves." The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, highlighting the subtle changes in the diner's layout. Security cameras were still present but blended seamlessly with the decor. The reinforced doors looked like simple renovations. Even the panic buttons were disguised as ordinary switches. "Remember when this all started?" Coach Thompson mused. "One gang thinking they could take over through fear. Now look, their tactics made us stronger than they ever were." Rachel's radio crackled with routine calls. No more gang activities, just ordinary small-town incidents. The Night Ravens' collapse had created a power vacuum, but instead of another gang moving in, communities had filled it with organization and resilience. "We've got inquiries from police departments in 3 states, Rachel added. "They want to implement similar community cooperation programs. Your Sullivan's strategy is becoming standard procedure." Becky paused at the counter, surveying the diner she'd helped transform. The regular customers chatted comfortably, no longer glancing nervously at the door. Business owners discussed plans for expansion rather than protection payments. The fear that had once permeated the town had been replaced by determination. "You know what impresses me most?" Patricia said, watching a group of young entrepreneurs setting up laptops at a corner table. "We didn't just stop one gang. We created something that prevents others from even trying." The afternoon wore on, the diner settling into its new role as both restaurant and community hub. Emily coordinated with other towns, sharing updates and improvements to their security protocols. Coach Thompson discussed training programs with visiting business owners. Every aspect of their defense had become a template for others to follow. "Sometimes I wonder what Drake thinks about all this," Frank mused, wiping down the counter. Sitting in his cell, watching everything he built turn into its own destruction. "He wanted to control through fear," Becky replied, refilling coffee cups. "Instead, he taught us how to be fearless." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the windows, Sullivan's Diner stood as more than just a business. It had become a beacon of hope, a living example of what communities could achieve when they refused to be intimidated. The night shift began, and with it came the subtle rotation of community watches, not out of fear now, but as a testament to their commitment to never returning to those darker days. The system they'd built had become self-sustaining, growing stronger with each passing day. Becky's final checks of the security system had become more habit than necessity. The town had changed, and so had she. The Marine who had sought peace in a small-town diner had found something more valuable, a community worth fighting for, and the knowledge that sometimes the greatest victories come not from confrontation, but from teaching others to stand strong together. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.